be here in the next hour. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. Non posso dire. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming for this last day. So I am very happy to open the last day with Gianfranco Casuso. He's also a friend of mine. And just to give you some information about the curriculum of Gianfranco. He's a professor of the Department of Humanities, Political Catholic University of Peru, where he also directs a research group of critical theory. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Goethe University, Frankfurt. Currently, he's a visiting professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Catania from the Justice Project. His work focuses on political and social philosophy, philosophy of economics, theory of democracy, modern philosophy, especially German idealism. He currently works on property and his activism counter with a colonial past, as well as issue of economic formality and popular economy and the solidarity economy. He currently directs the project Property Regime, Extractive Industrial and Autonomous Government, and indeed is a proposal for theoretical construction based on the analysis of 3 cases in Peru funded by Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. And just some selected publications. He's author of several influential books, papers, including Philosophy and Critical Social, Contribution para una teoria crítica della società e della politica, L'arma della critica, Dimensione dell'esclusione, and more recently some article and contribution in book as Contained Pathology of Recognition, toward the Imperial Expressive Study for Social Critics, European Journal of Academic American Philosophy, how neoliberalism turned the work ethic against workers, and how workers can take back Constellation, 2025, Social Criticism and the Foundation of Democracy, to paragraph model on the need to generate problems in democratized social critics, social and political philosophy, after James Bonner, and in Routledge 2025. And finally, just to mention some another publication, Maxim, Pragmatics and Precedent in Mariateghi's Critical Thought, Reflection on Emerging of Social Criticism in Peru, in Global Critical Theories, edited and published from Spring. So today, Gianfranco Casuso will present the presentation of the title, The Limits of Workplace Democracy, Reflection on the Coloniality of Labor. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Enuncio, for the presentation and for this wonderful invitation. It's a great honor to be here with you and to share these thoughts with you as well. So, the meaning, the structure, and normative significance of labor are undergoing deep transformations in the 21st century. The combined effects of automation, platformization, and widespread precarization, are not merely disrupting traditional employment relations, they are displacing the very categories through which labor has been historically understood and valued in modern societies. Thank you. The model of labor inherited from industrial modernity, centered on wage labor, juridical employment contracts, and the promise of social integration, has entered a state of structural crisis. This crisis is not simply economic or institutional, it is conceptual, insofar as our inherited categories no longer adequately capture the realities of labor in life under late capitalism. Alongside the erosion of stable employment and the fragmentation of the formal labor market, a vast array of alternative economic forms persists and expands. Reciprocal networks of care and subsistence, mutual aid, and community-based economies continue to be essential to the reproduction of life across the globe. These developments have prompted renewed philosophical engagement with the question of labor. In particular, contemporary critical theorists such as Axel Honneth, Elizabeth Anderson, and Emmanuel Renaud have sought to reclaim the ethical and democratic dimensions of work. It is well known that Honneth seeks to reconceptualize the workplace as a potential site of democratic self-governance and mutual recognition, rather than merely a sphere of economic coordination. Anderson, in turn, develops a pragmatist, egalitarian view of work that links economic freedom to democratic voice and collective agency, which critiques the capture of the work ethic by neoliberal ideology and seeks to recover its emancipatory potential. Renaud similarly argues that the critique of work must be centered on its normative significance as a domain of social integration and personal development, emphasizing that work can be both a site of subjection and a terrain of struggle for recognition. In my presentation, I want to suggest that despite their undeniable merits, these approaches remain shaped by a set of conceptual assumptions that limit their ability to grasp the full diversity and complexity of contemporary labor practices. For that same reason, they also struggle to realize their own normative ambitions regarding the democratization of work. My argument is that these strands of critical theory need to be expanded and reoriented through a more systematic engagement with economic formations that lie beyond the traditional horizon of wage labor. Theories of the informal, solidarity, and popular economy offer crucial conceptual tools to this end. Although they retain a profound ambivalence derived from their often marginal character, they can also challenge the assumption that labor is exhaustively defined by its juridical codification or its integration into capitalist production. Instead, they foreground labor's embeddedness in concrete social relations, practices of mutual dependence, and non-commodified forms of value creation. By bringing these critical frameworks into dialogue with the work of Honneth, Anderson, and Renaud, I seek to open a space for rethinking labor as a plural, historically situated and contested phenomenon. The aim is not to discard the normative ambitions these theories advance, but to reconstruct them on more inclusive and ontologically adequate grounds. Let me briefly outline the structure of my presentation. In the first section, I highlight the main points of convergence among the thinkers discussed. In the second section, I examine three obstacles they identify to advancing the work-based democratization. I then propose three structural factors that help explain these difficulties and address the internal tensions in the author's own arguments. The third section sketches two possible ways of moving beyond these impasses. Finally, in the fourth section, I present four case studies that illustrate and support my central argument. Begin with the first. In reconstructing the projects of Honneth, Anderson, and Renaud, we can identify a shared conceptual ground that both enables and constrains their respective attempts to reconnect labor and democracy. These common premises are not merely neutral starting points. They actively shape the horizon of what can be imagined as a viable alternative to contemporary forms of domination at work. The difficulty of democratizing labor today, I suggest, lies not only in structural obstacles, but also in the internal limits of the conceptual framework through which labor is currently theorized. All three thinkers share an important ambition. They seek to rehabilitate labor as a central normative and institutional domain. Each diagnoses the erosion of worker dignity, and each calls for the democratization of work as a remedy. Yet, despite these critical insights, their analysis remain firmly anchored in a specific institutional image of labor, namely the formal, hierarchical workplace typically modeled on mid to large-scale firms. This shared focus is not accidental. It reflects a deeper structural analogy that organizes their thinking. Just as political authority must be democratically legitimized, workplace authority, too, must be subjected to democratic control. This analogy is, of course, analytically powerful, as it enables them to reveal authoritarian dynamics within firms and to formulate compelling claims for workplace democracy. What unites these approaches, however, is a persistent formalism, the assumption that justice in the workplace depends primarily on reforming official structures through internal participatory mechanisms. Yet it is precisely at this point that a significant blind spot appears, since it is becoming increasingly evident that the vast majority of labor relations worldwide do not conform to this institutional model. Moreover, as we will see later, informal employment, precarious and casualized work, domestic labor, subsistence activities, and gig platform economies are not peripheral anomalies. On the contrary, they are structurally central, especially across large parts of the global south. The second major point of convergence follows directly from the institutional framing just analyzed. Is the conviction that labor must be reclaimed as a central site of democratic life. Against neoliberal fragmentation, the three authors argue that work is a sphere where recognition, autonomy, and collective life are enacted. To democratize the workplace is thus to extend democracy itself. This argument has considerable force. In societies where formal political participation is limited to periodic elections and policy decisions are often inaccessible or technocratically insulated, the workplace emerges as a primary locus of lived authority. People spend a significant part of their waking life under the supervision of others, subjected to disciplinary norms, performance evaluations, and unilateral decisions that shape their everyday existence. On these grounds, Anderson characterizes firms as private governments, spaces in which employers exercise largely unchecked power. From her perspective, workplace domination should be understood as a civic problem, one that calls for participatory structures and stronger mechanisms of accountability. Honneth, from a different angle, similarly emphasizes the normative significance of work. He argues that labor can serve as a source of social esteem and solidarity, yet this potential is systematically undermined by market imperatives, which makes democratic transformation necessary. Renaud complements these views by highlighting labor's symbolic and integrative function. For him, democratic practices in the workplace are not only desirable in themselves, but essential to maintaining social cohesion. All this draw on a rich tradition of participatory democratic theory, from John Dewey's conception of democracy as a way of life to Carol Pateman's argument for participatory learning through democratic engagement at work. But in these accounts, too, democracy ultimately operates as an external ideal imposed upon labor. This becomes especially clear in Honneth's rejection of the aims of overcoming alienation or realizing autonomy through work, which he characterizes as overly perfectionist and dependent on the assumption that labor possesses an intrinsic value. As his most recent work makes evident, democracy is instead elevated to the primary normative horizon against which labor relations are to be assessed. Yet this move reconfigures the problem. By bracketing the transformative aspiration historically associated with the struggles over alienation and self-realization, the normative center of gravity shifts toward a model of political democratization that is treated as conceptually prior to and externally corrective of work itself. Moreover, the conception of democracy underwritten this framework draws heavily on a particular narrative of political development, one shaped by the institutional evolution of European constitutional and social democratic traditions, rather than emerging from the heterogeneous histories and conflicts internal to labor practices across different social contexts. As a result, democracy risks appearing less as a form generated within labor's own dynamics and more as a standard projected onto it from a historically specific political trajectory. This problem brings us to the third and last point these approaches share. Although each theorist offers a historically sensitive reconstruction of labor's moral, social, or political transformation, they do so within narrow historical frames largely centered on Western capitalist democracies. In doing so, they often abstract from the broader and structurally entangled histories that have shaped labor relations on a global scale, thereby limiting the scope of their explanatory and normative claims. This becomes particularly clear in Anderson's most recent work, Hijacked, the book Hijacked, where the central axis of historical development is identified with the rise, transformation, and eventual hijacking of the work ethic, a cultural and moral formation she traces, quote, from the Puritans through the classical political economists in Britain and to a lesser extent, Germany, end quote. Framed in this way, the genealogy of labor's normative meaning is anchored primarily in a specific intellectual and institutional trajectory, which then serve as an implicit backdrop for assessing contemporary distortions. Anderson, contends that the work ethic was once rooted in a political economy that enabled ordinary people to thrive, but was later appropriated by neoliberal elites to justify inequality, discipline the poor, and weaken worker protections. However, in reconstructing this trajectory, she largely sidelines the history of slavery, settler colonialism, and racialized exclusion that profoundly shaped labor relations in the United States, even as she explicitly acknowledges their significance. She makes these deliberate omissions even while conceding that without attending to such histories, quote, it is impossible to understand the centrality of self-employment in the American